All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to week number 12. That is right, week number 12 of your 9489 class, which is your cultural heritage class. As always, I'm your professor, Dr. Jace K. Austin, and what we are going to do this week is there really isn't much of a state of the course update, but this is a topic this week that I get very passionate about. So this is going to be a very, very long check-in video. Make sure that you speed it up because I might be talking for a long, long time. But this Confederate commemoration thing is just something that really kind of gets to me, and there are a lot of thoughts that I have in relation to this particular module here. So first things first, let's go ahead and do the state of the course update because there isn't, like I said, there isn't much to know. Basically, you all just need to keep doing your discussion board prompts from here on out. There are some of you who have not turned in your For Heritage's paper. Those of you who have not done that, I think all of you, though, have, it's several of you, but I think all of you have asked for extensions. However, if you did not ask for an extension and you have not turned it in, then you need to go ahead and turn it in and be prepared for any late deductions that you might have with that, okay? So that is the main thing. Aside from that, just keep doing the discussion board posts and know that there is going to be one more synced session, and that is going to be on the it will be on the 24th, April the 24th. So about 2 weeks from now, 2-ish weeks, 2 weeks from now, we'll have Josh Shepard with the University of Colorado Boulder, and he will be talking to us about the Library of Congress Sound Archival Project, which is a great heritage a great cultural heritage discussion that I think you all will enjoy. All right, so with that said, and other than that, just keep, if you're doing a heritage project, go ahead and keep working on that. Or if not, then just be prepared to, this particular module this week is a module that's going to be helpful for your final paper if you are electing to, or have elected to go the final paper route, as opposed to doing a project. All right, that said, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Confederate commemoration and get some insights from yours truly as a son of the South, a man from rural North Carolina, a black man from rural North Carolina at that, who has some very, very strong opinions on this issue. All right, give me one moment. Okay, now in previous semesters, there have been like a ton of things that I've talked about in this particular check-in video with week 12 and the Confederate commemoration. There are a lot of things that I talk about. I may or may not hit them all this time around. Usually it takes about 35 minutes unsped up for me to get through it all, but hopefully that won't be the case this time around. Because quite frankly, also, I can't really remember everything that I said last semester and last spring and the spring before last. So this one might be a bit shorter if I don't have as many things to say, or it might be a bit longer if I think of new things to say. But the main thing that I want to say when it comes to Confederate commemoration and the ethics of it is that a lot of these cultural heritage things that we've been talking about throughout the semester are things that are paid for with taxpayer money, with public funding. Okay, so like the endeavors that libraries and archives do, a lot of that stuff is usually covered through taxpayer funding. Even at private colleges, private universities that have libraries, a lot of times they are benefiting from financial aid, which is coming from the federal government and that sort of thing. And people have to pay in theory, people have to pay that financial aid back. But in theory, these are, even if you're at a private university and working for an archive or a library at a private university, you're still benefiting from public dollars a lot of the time. And so what I want to say, the first thing that I want to say is, and by the way, that's not, excuse me, hold on. I do also want to make clear that it's not just libraries and archives that are publicly funded. A lot of times there are museums that a lot of times are funded at least in part with taxpayer dollars. There are parks that are funded with taxpayer dollars. A lot of times when we think about sporting events as part of cultural heritage, a lot of these stadiums and that sort of thing are funded with public dollars as well. And you'll even see, you may even be aware, if you're Missouri based, that there was a tax initiative to where the Royals and the Chiefs were trying to get the taxpayers in Jackson County to uh, fund stadium improvements, I believe, for the Royals and the Chiefs, and that initiative failed on the ballot last week. Okay, so yeah, these are, and the list can go on and on and on. There are a lot of festivals that are funded by the municipalities or the counties or the states that they're in. State fairs, I think, are at least partially funded by the state, I believe, and various other things. So a lot of times public money does come into play with cultural heritage. And so there are some ethics that are actually attached to that. And so what I would say is Confederate commemoration. This is the main point that I want to get at. So I'm getting the main point out of the way. And then if you want to, because the longer I talk, probably the more of you are going to cut this off. So I want to get this main point out of the way first, and you're going to see it in one of these readings. There are costs to Confederate commemoration. And I think that this is something that should, honestly, I feel that this should invalidate Confederate commemoration at its core. Now, don't get me wrong. Anyone should be able to do whatever they want. Well, not whatever they want, but if you are on your private property, if you want to fly a Confederate flag, fine, whatever. If you got private property on your house, if you want to have Confederate flag stickers on your personal vehicle, whatever. I'm not a fan of it, but I am a fan of people having the right to do that. But when it comes to public money, this is where I get concerned, and this is why this is such an important article here. So, not even dealing with the slavery component of it. The slavery component is a big piece of it. Don't get me wrong. The slavery component is a huge piece of this. But when I talk about Confederate commemoration being improperly funded by taxpayer dollars, it's not just because, or even primarily because of the slavery issue. The reason why I think this is such a flawed thing to do is because we've got to remember that, for better or worse, the Confederates were, they were people who made war against the United States of America. They made war against the federal government of the United States of America. They, in my opinion, from my perspective, the southern states and the states that withdrew from the Union actually betrayed the country. If you ask me, they're traitors. And so with that said, Confederates who killed American troops should not be commemorated with American taxpayer money. That's just bottom line for me. I think that you'll be hard pressed to find another example of enemies of the state whose commemoration is actually funded by the state anywhere in the world. I mean, I'm sure there are examples of it, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find those examples. And so that's one of my takeaways when I talk about Confederate commemoration and the ethics surrounding it. I do feel that I think that if you have any, to me, it's just like, and some of you may think it's a stretch, and if so, you can say it in the discussion board this week, or you can say it in the free for all or whatever. But I think that funding Confederate commemoration and funding the commemoration of those who made war against the United States, to me, that's no different from funding commemoration of the Nazis or when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, I know there are different other Japanese commemorations within the United States, but I'm talking specifically if somebody had commemorated the actual Japanese pilots who had bombed Pearl Harbor. I see no difference between that and commemorating the Confederate traitors. Now, I know that the states' rights issue comes in, and a lot of people say that, a lot of people try to say that because there was never a discussion as to whether or not the states had the right to withdraw from the Union, you can't call them traitors if they were going for states' rights. And first of all, that's not apparently historically accurate. Now, hopefully, if somebody is a smart historian in this class and they can really put the gauntlet down and say with clarity, back in the founding days, who believed that the states had the right to withdraw from the Union and who did not. But apparently that was some sort of, apparently that was entertained by the founding fathers, and the Federalists specifically. Again, I'm hazy on the details and I apologize for that, but I'm not a historian. But apparently that discussion of could states leave the Union was actually talked about by the founding fathers. And apparently there was a vibe. It was never written, but apparently there was, it was never written into law or codified into law, I should say, but apparently there was a vibe with some of the founding fathers that that the states did not have the right to withdraw from the Union. In fact, now I want to Google that. Hold on. Okay, so some of you may wag your fingers at me for this Wikipedia research that I'm doing. But if you have me in reference, then you should remember that I say that Wikipedia's issue is not that it's inaccurate. Wikipedia's issue is stability and authority, okay? So I am going to use Wikipedia in the interest of time, and I am going to say that, yes, so we get the sense that as far as the perpetual union, apparently John Jay and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were among the founding fathers who believed, at least at some point, that states did not have the right to withdraw from the Union or secede from the Union. And apparently George Washington also referred to an indissoluble union. I am going to butcher that word and I'm not even going to try again. But yes, so George Washington also believed that the Union should not be, you shouldn't be able to dissolve the Union. However, there were founding fathers such as Gouverneur Morris who did believe that there were conditions wherein the states should be allowed to secede from the Union. So, because I've heard not actual historians, but I've heard, your YouTube pseudo historians, I've heard some of them say that the issue of whether or not states had the right to withdraw from the Union hadn't really come up prior to the mid 1800s, around the time of the Civil War. And that's just actually not true. This is something that the founding fathers had entertained. And again, somebody who's more well-versed and scholarly within the realm of American history, if you want to provide further clarification on that, you're welcome to. But I say that to say that because the issue had come up, because the issue had been debated by the founding fathers as to whether the state should have the right to withdraw from the Union, and because many of the founding fathers, including George Washington, saw that the Union was supposed to be indissoluble, because of that, I think that it's a bogus argument to say that, oh, these were just states' rights people who were, they believed in states' rights and they weren't traitors, but they were loyal to their state instead of their country. I don't buy that. At the individual level, I'm sure that that was the conviction of some people. But at the end of the day, I think that for the most part, what you're dealing with are traitors who are trying to rewrite the narrative. But they were people who were just fine with leaving the Union for the sake of, if that's what it was going to take in order to keep slavery as a viable part of their economic system within their state. Okay. But for me, and I will say that for me personally, I am somebody who sees myself as an American before I see myself as a North Carolinian. Okay. So do with that what you will. So, that is my thing as far as taxpayer money. We should not be funding commemoration of those who made war against the United States, regardless of, unless they really had a noble cause. And the noble cause might be, for instance, I guess you could make the argument that Nat Turner, made war against the country. Again, I wouldn't agree with that because of, declarations of war and all of that stuff. But if you were to try to argue that Nat Turner was a traitor, then I would turn around and say that Nat Turner fought for a noble cause. And so commemoration of Nat Turner would be okay. But commemoration of the Confederacy does have some ethical concerns. All right, let's leave that and go to the next thing. All right, so now that we've talked about the taxpayer element of this, the next thing I want to talk about for a little while is whether or not it is appropriate to actually name cultural heritage institutions after Confederate soldiers and after other undesirables. And I actually think that my belief on this one may surprise you all. It may not be what you expected from a black man, but at the same time, I would say that I would say that, no race of people are a monolith. And so there are going to be some black people who do agree with me, and there are going to be some black people who don't agree with me. But I think that people are actually surprised by the spectrum of black thought on this issue, and the fact that there are black people who kind of go against the grain on this. So I'm not just going to talk about Confederate commemoration at this point. I'm also going to talk about commemoration of those who were slave owners, okay? So let me get to the Confederate commemoration part first. And should there be American institutions named after Robert E. Lee? Should there be American institutions named after Stonewall Jackson and Jefferson Davis? And again, I grew up in North Carolina and in Virginia, and you see that all over the place. There were Robert E. Lee high schools in Virginia. There were Stonewall Jackson bridges in Virginia that I encountered. There was a Jefferson Davis highway near where I lived that some of my friends lived in trailer parks on Jefferson Davis highway, and I would go hang out with them sometimes back in high school. And so I say that to say that, yeah, we do in the United States, we do still have plenty of institutions, plenty of highways, plenty of roads, plenty of historical markers, et cetera, that are named after Confederate figures like those. So what you have to ask yourself at this point is it appropriate to name these institutions after Confederate figures? My answer to that would also again be no. And the reason for that, though, is not because they owned slaves, and it's not because they defended slavery. That is actually not why I take a no stance on that, and that may surprise some of you. Again, the reason why I don't think American institutions should be named after these Confederate figures is because these Confederate figures, in my opinion, are traitors. And I do not believe that we should be naming high schools after traitors, and I do not believe we should be, naming highways and this, that, and the other after traitors. Anyone who made war against the United States of America, I don't think that anything public should be named after you. Now, yes, if somebody has like a private something, a private, I don't know, a private whatever they've got. If they got something private that they own and they want to name it after Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee or something like that, by all means do that because it's private. But anything that's public, including a public school, absolutely not. Don't do that. Now, again, private, so maybe a private school would be an example. If there is a Southern segregation academy, as we call them back in the South, one of these private schools that started after integration in order to give white people a way to keep their kids away from black people. If there's some prep academy in the South that wants to call itself Stonewall Jackson Prep Academy, by all means, go ahead, as long as you're not getting public dollars. Go for it. But listen to what I said. So what I said was, I actually don't believe that the ownership of slaves is a disqualifier, okay? So this comes back to, and again, some of y'all might think that this is crazy for a black person to say, but there are actually black people who do agree with my stance here. So a lot of them. So when we get away from these Confederate people and we talk about some of these Americans who have owned slaves, who have also at certain points recently seen their names stripped off of things, people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and some others, should those founding fathers who owned slaves, should they be commemorated? Should they have things named after them, like a George Washington High School or a Thomas Jefferson High School and that sort of thing? And my answer to that is, no, I'm going to come back to Thomas Jefferson because there's something different going on there. But when I talk about some of these other slave owners like George Washington, I think James Madison owned slaves. Just as a fact check, yes, James Madison owned slaves. There were some founding fathers who did not own slaves. I don't think John Adams ever owned slaves. I think, in fact, that John Adams was one of the earliest one of the earliest anti-slavery voices in this country. But yeah, for people like George Washington and James Madison and some of these other people, I actually think it's perfectly fine, even though they own slaves, and I don't like that. As a black man, I'm very happy to be free. And as a descendant of American slaves, I do feel that there is progress in the fact that we have done away with the institution, and almost nobody is pro-slavery anymore. But having said that, I don't feel that because George Washington and James Madison and these people own slaves, I don't feel that that necessarily disqualifies them from being commemorated with having buildings and schools and highways and that sort of thing named after them. Because at the end of the day, and this is what I compare it to, and some of you may think that this is a bogus comparison, but I'm going with it until somebody tells me why they think it's a bogus comparison. So, and I use this comparison a lot, okay? Slavery, whether we like it or not, slavery was not seen as, it wasn't seen by the majority of people as a ethical no-no back in the times that George Washington and James Madison owned slaves. Now, yes, there was abolitionist rhetoric going on even at that time, but there had been rhetoric going on against slavery even back in the early days of the Catholic Church, so long before colonizers even got to the present day United States. They were having discussions in apparently in modern day in Europe back not too long after Jesus died. They were having discussions as to whether or not slavery was appropriate. These were actually conversations that were going on in the Catholic Church centuries before the United States was founded. But in the 1700s and the 1800s, the earlier 1800s, yes, we still hadn't gotten to the point where people were saying, where the majority of people were saying that slavery was an ethical no-no. And so when it is still tolerated by society, then for me, it's hard to make the case of blaming people who, or, stripping people of honors who were doing what was socially acceptable in their day, even if we know better now. And certainly we know better now. But in their day, people like George Washington and James Madison, they had a lot of support behind them in their endeavors of owning slaves, and a lot of other people throughout the country at that point owned slaves, not just in the South, but at that point, people in the North as well. And so what I would actually compare that to, and again, this might freak some of you out, but I would actually compare that to today, in the current day. I am somebody who does something that is still seen as ethically okay by the majority of Americans, but there is a discussion, and I don't think it will be okay in the future. And what I'm going to talk about, and again, some of you might think, hey, this is a really strange comparison, but I'm going to compare this to the fact that I'm an omnivore. So I'm somebody who eats vegetables, meat, dairy, the whole 9 yards. I like things from all of the food groups, right? And we've had discussions for a long time now as to whether or not it is morally sound for people to eat meat, for people to eat the flesh of other animals, right? And I still do it. I've heard the arguments, and honestly, to be honest with you, I can't make an ethical argument in favor of my continued eating of meat. It's just something that I like to do, so I do it. And I like dairy, I like yogurt and cheese and all that, and so I still eat those things. But people have been making the case, and I think people have been making the case very well, that ethically, you should certainly not have factory farms and have these animals just living in misery for the entire time that they live until they're slaughtered to make food for people. And there are other ethical considerations as to why we possibly shouldn't eat meat, including that if we didn't farm meat and consume it in the ways that we did, we might have more food to go around. If we were all on strictly plant-based diets, we would possibly globally have more food for people to eat, and that might solve world hunger. So there are, and so what I worry about, and this is why I kind of have a little grace for Washington and Madison, even if people don't feel they deserve it. But let's say, no, I'm never going to be important enough that anything is going to be named after me. The only thing that's named after me is going to be my funeral program. It's going to say in memory of Jason Austin. But aside from that, nothing will ever be named after me. I'm just not relevant. So, but in a hypothetical situation where something was named after me, what I would hate is for me to, let's say I died in, I don't know, 2044, if I died 20 years from now. And then let's say that in 2144, let's say that there's a school named after me after I die in my hometown. Let's say there's a Jason Austin Elementary that's created. And then let's say that 50 to 100 years after that school is erected, somebody comes back and says, well, hey, this guy was a bad guy. Let's say that 100 years after the school is erected, meat is outlawed, and the vegetarians have won, and the vegetarians have made the case that successfully made the case that nobody should eat meat, and nobody on earth is eating meat ever again, right? So let's say that that were to happen, and then people came back and said, yo, this guy was a barbarian. We have this school named after Jason Austin, and this was a guy who ate meat. He ate the flesh of other animals, and he ate factory farm meat, so that, you know, those animals were tortured and imprisoned and this, that, and the other. And then they stripped me of my honors and decided that I was a bad person due to something that nobody in the current day is really seriously holding me accountable for, right? And so that's why, again, some people might think that this is a weird comparison, but that's why I give a little grace to George Washington and James Madison, because they were the people who, for better or worse, were doing things that were socially acceptable in that time. Again, there were anti-slavery people at that time, but certainly not like what you would see today, where it's almost universal that people are anti-slavery. It was a debatable issue at that time. And so if people weren't holding them accountable and saying, hey, you're wrong for that, if society as a whole wasn't doing that, then I don't feel that I can really judge them and say that they should be stripped of their honors just because of the slave ownership. No, I said I was going to come back to Thomas Jefferson. And what I'm going to say about Thomas Jefferson is that case is a little different for me, and I think it's a little different for a lot of Black people because of Sally Hemings. And there is some historical debate as to whether or not there's just a lot of historical debate and confusion, and I don't know what's true as far as, you know, how Sally Hemings felt about the situation she found herself in with Thomas Jefferson. I don't know anything about that. I've had people say that she knew she was a rape victim. I had people say that she felt that she loved Thomas Jefferson, and I've had everything in between, and I don't know what's true. I don't know that she ever wrote her feelings down. So having said that, the Thomas Jefferson thing is a little different because it's not just about ownership of persons, but that is also about the exploitation, the sexual exploitation of a minor. Okay, and that's something that I just can't, and I don't think society ever can get past, or, well, I shouldn't say that because clearly that's not the case. Society does get past it when it comes to Thomas Jefferson, and if it's true that Donald Trump sexually exploited a minor, then society apparently has gotten past that as well. But anyway, I'm not going to go there because that's getting into some hot button stuff. But yeah, so I just want to say that, yeah, Thomas Jefferson falls into a different boat. And I look at him not just as a slave owner, but I personally also do look at Thomas Jefferson as a rapist and as somebody who exploited a juvenile Black woman, and, well, a juvenile Black girl, and therefore somebody who should not be honored in the same way. But again, that's something that is up for debate, and I don't have the one true or the one right opinion there at all. So all of this starts to get a little dicey when you start talking about naming controversies and that sort of thing, and whether or not people, whether or not you think that people should be honored by having their names on stuff, because nobody is perfect. Nobody who has ever walked this earth has been perfect. That could be a controversial, me being somebody who's a Noahide, which is a faith based on Judaism. That may be a little controversial to those of you who are Christians and do believe that Jesus was indeed perfect. I do believe that Jesus existed, but I am going to say that I doubt that Jesus was perfect. It's probably just that he has been recorded as perfect by those who believe him to be part of a God Trinity. Okay. But in my religious faith, I do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so I also don't operate. First of all, my idea of what the Messiah is different from what Christians believe the Messiah is or will be. And because, yeah, let's not get into all of that because of timing, but all of that to say, I don't think that, because nobody is perfect, you have to then entertain this question of whether or not anything should actually be subject to being named after a person, because every person, if you dig deep enough, they're going to have flaws. And so I guess part of the question is, what were their flaws? And we'll probably never know a lot of people's flaws. There are probably people that we hold in high regard. Certainly there are some people that we hold in high regard, and it's difficult to speak negatively of them. But if you do look into the history of some of these people, even they had negative things associated with them. And Martin Luther King Jr. is actually an example of this. So a lot of people, even a lot of conservatives that I would say, even a lot of right-wingers, I want to use the word conservatives, even a lot of right-wingers that I believe are actually racist people and white supremacists, they tend to revere Martin Luther King in a certain way, but they take Martin Luther King out of context a lot. And they don't realize certain things, like they always go back to judge by the content of my character or content of their character and not the color of their skin. But Martin Luther King was in favor of reparations, and he was in favor of affirmative action. Okay, so we're not talking about somebody who was advocating for a colorblind society at all. All right. But Martin Luther King, he was certainly a womanizer. I don't think that that's even up for debate anymore. And there is also now some concern that he may have actually been also a sexually abusive person himself, not just a womanizer, but a sexually abusive person. We don't know these things for sure. There's some things that the FBI knows that they haven't released yet, and I'm not going to get into all of that. But, you could get to stripping all of these people's names if you find out what happened, some of these truths about Martin Luther King. He could be stripped. If there are things that we have not discovered yet about a lot of these other great historical figures, including people who fought for the Union. Like a lot of people think that Ulysses Grant is great, and I've known of schools that were named after Ulysses Grant and things of that nature. But what if time revealed that, Grant also had a very big dark side or something like that? Do we strip his name off of things that are named after him and that sort of thing? And so you really have to be careful with these naming controversies, because nobody is going to be perfect. But in my opinion, I feel that we should develop some sort of rubric that determines whether or not the good outweighs the bad, or whether or not, I'm a believer that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Let me say that. And so if you're looking for, okay, I'm not going to commemorate anyone unless that person is perfect, I think that could be an enemy of the good, because I think that you could still be missing out on commemorating very, very, very good and very, very important people because of some flaws that they had, even when those flaws were not seen as flaws during when they were actually present and existing in society. Okay, so that's something that I would want or challenge you all to keep in mind as well. Okay, so yeah, this one was long. Like I was going to say, it was long, but there's no need for me to drone on any further. We'll talk in the discussion prompts and in the discussion boards and that sort of thing. And if you have some things that you want to add that are outside of the purview of what's in the prompt for this week, then by all means, you can go for the into the free for all area, and you can have a further conversation about that. And you can talk about whether or not you agree or disagree disagree with me on anything that I've said in this check-in video, because I'm very passionate. Here's another thing that I want to say. This one's probably going to go into 40 minutes, and I apologize. And again, I hope you sped it up. But here's something that I always point out when I'm talking about this Confederate commemoration stuff, and I almost missed it this time, but I'm not. All right, so one thing that has come up in the past, and it shows that, to me, it illustrates that a lot of these Confederate defenders are people who see black people as a little less than, maybe less than human or less deserving of respect or something of that nature. But this is something that has happened to me before, and I've got friends all over the spectrum. Again, I grew up in rural North Carolina. I've got friends who are white and who wear Confederate apparel, and they are on that heritage, not hate shit. And I don't agree with that, but that's what they're on, and that's what it is. And, if they respect me, then I respect them, and I'm going to just leave it alone. There's no need to actually discuss it because we're not going to change each other's minds, right? But having said that, one thing that I will never forget, and I've had arguments and debates with people about whether or not Confederate commemoration is appropriate. I've had plenty of those discussions with white people throughout my life. And one thing that I'll never forget, because this happens a lot, and when it happened to me, I just had the opportunity to respond the way that I wanted. You will often hear when people who believe in Confederate commemoration, when those people are defending Confederate commemoration, one thing that they love to say, and they will say it a lot, they love saying, "You don't know anyone who was a slave," which is true. I don't know anyone who was ever a slave. Yes, I am descendant from slaves on 3 of my 4 grandparental lines. One of my grandparental lines, my paternal grandmother, she was black, but she belonged to a group of people who were free people of color in the state of North Carolina. And that's a term that they use, free people of color. But my other 3 grandparent lines are people who were descended from slaves. And one thing that people like to say a lot is, "You don't know anyone who was a slave." And it's true, but you got to ask yourself, so what? Because one thing that these people don't think about when they're saying that, and it's weird to me that they don't think about it, they will look you dead in the face with a straight face and think nothing of it by saying, "What's your problem? You don't know anyone who was a slave." And they don't think about the fact that they don't know anyone who was a Confederate soldier. In the same way that I don't know anyone who was ever a slave, they did not know anyone who was ever a Confederate soldier. They might have ancestors who were Confederate soldiers, just like I have ancestors who were slaves. But the thing about that is, if you don't know anyone who was a Confederate soldier, then how is telling me that I don't know anyone who was a slave, how is that a valid argument for saying that I shouldn't care? Maybe since you don't know anyone who was a Confederate soldier, maybe you shouldn't care. But they do, and they care very, very strongly. Talk to these Southern boys who are wearing that Confederate apparel, and I can assure you they care a lot about their ancestors who fought for the Confederacy, even though they didn't know them. But yet they expect me not to care about my ancestors who were slaves just because I didn't know them. And that is something that I think is rooted in respect for humanity, and the fact that they lack the same respect for my humanity that they have for their own. Again, a lot of people see us as black people with these unconscious or subconscious biases. They do see us as less intelligent. They see Africans as having these lower IQs overall and everything. And so since we're descended from Africans, we have lower IQs and this, that, and the other. And they, everything that's institutionalized in this country's systems actually does reinforce that. So people think that even if they aren't thinking it at the forefront, a lot of people do see me as something less. Something that's less human, something that's more primitive, so forth and so on. And so that's how they get away with saying that, or that's how they get away with entertaining this idea that I shouldn't care about my ancestors because I didn't know them, but yet they can still care about their ancestors even though they didn't know their ancestors who fought for the Confederacy. It's a simple lack of empathy. And one thing that I want to always be a centerpiece of this cultural heritage class, and something that you all think about as you work through your library and information science careers, is empathy. Empathy is at the forefront of what we do through all of this. And so hopefully what I've said tonight kind of illustrates that for you in a different way when it comes to framing this discussion around Confederate commemoration. But with that said, I've spoken it long enough. We're not going to go to 45 minutes. We are going to cut this off right now. I am Dr. Chase, and yes, I would say that the Civil War was indeed about race. We'll talk to you next week.